Welcome everyone to part 1 of Unit 9, which is social psychology. So first I just want to start with just kind of talking about what social psychology is, and then we'll get into kind of our main topic today, which is going to be social cognition. So social psychology is actually pretty straightforward. It's a study of how we think about, influence, and relate to one another. Right? Pretty straightforward. It's all the things we've already kind of talked about in psychology, but now we're thinking about the social aspect. The big thing here is we're looking at thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that either concern other people or are influenced by other people. The thoughts, feelings, behaviors part is really important. These are all things we've talked about, right? Thoughts is cognitive, the feelings is emotion and motivation, behaviors we've talked about throughout all of everything, but especially focused on with learning, right? So these are things that we've already kind of talked about separately, but now we're looking at, how are they similar? How are they different when it's concerning others or when it's being influenced by others, right? So we're going to see a little bit more of that and kind of see some of the crossover between these different kind of fields of study. So we're going to start off here talking about social cognition. So what is social cognition? It should actually be pretty straightforward because we've already talked about cognition in this class, right? So social cognition is focusing on how people process, store, and apply information about other people and social situations. Again, processing information, storing information, and applying information or retrieving information, right, is exactly what we already talked about in cognition. Social cognition is just those same exact things, but now it's in relation to people, in relation to social situations. So again, just kind of connecting those two pieces. So the first thing we're going to talk about is attribution theory. So attribution theory is a theory that's used to explain people's behavior. So this is something we actually kind of naturally do. Basically, when we look at a situation or we look at people's behavior, right, we either credit that behavior as being caused by the situation or a person's disposition. Okay, situation or disposition. So a simple example and why I have these images up here is the Zimmerman case, right, and Trayvon Martin, right? We look at this situation and later on we'll watch kind of the video in class and how you decide what happened in the situation, how you decide who you feel is in the wrong or the right, how you kind of determine what's going on, pretty much has everything to do with attribution theory, right? Where we look at the situation or we look at, what we know about the situation and we kind of go, okay, do I think this was caused by just the situation they were in, right? Because of the environment, because of what, somebody did, this person's going to react this way. Or do I think it has to do with personality, right? Is there some sort of characteristic for one or both of these people that causes an event to happen? Right? Now, again, this is really important, and the reason I use this case specifically is how you decide, right, what you think happened, how you decide kind of wrong and right, has a lot to do with this attribution theory, right? We don't necessarily feel bad or mind so much if somebody does something because they're in a really bad situation, right? We look at that very differently than they did something because it's part of their personality, right? So we can kind of see that crossover a little bit there. So breaking down attribution theory a little bit more, I mentioned already that there's two different kind of ways that we can view what happened or and what happens in general and how people behave. We have dispositional attributions and we have situational attributions. So dispositional or personal attributions are internal. These are characteristics about a person, like personality and intelligence. So you can probably think of someone who just has certain personality traits, right? So maybe, for example, they have a kind of short temper, right? They tend to get angry pretty quickly. That type of person, when they, maybe they yell at somebody, you see them and they're like yelling at someone, you wouldn't probably look at them and go, okay, that is a characteristic trait. That is a dispositional attribution, right? They are acting this way because it is part of who they are. Okay, part of their personality. Situational attribution is environmental factors. So how environmental factors explain why a person acts a certain way or why they behave a certain way. So again, you might have somebody in the exact same situation. Maybe you see them and they're yelling at someone, but they tend to be really, really quiet, really soft-spoken, and you've never really seen them angry before. You might look at that and go, okay, they're acting this way because of what happened, because of the situation they're in, because of the environment that they're in, right? So you can kind of look at how these two things are going to vary. Now, with these different attribution theories, and well, I should say with attribution theory and how we try to attribute behaviors, we have some kind of biases and some issues with what we do. So one of the big ones is what is called fundamental attribution error. So fundamental attribution error is basically our tendency to focus on personal causes and underestimate situations when we're talking about behavior. Now, this is specifically for other people's behavior. So when I look at other people, I tend to overestimate the personal aspect and underestimate the situational aspect. A really simple example of this is something we can see in school, and this is kind of why I have these two images on here. So I'm sure all of you have been in a class, and there's a student that you've had in class who maybe they show up late every day, or maybe they sleep in class every single day, but they just don't really seem to get much done, right? And a lot of times what happens is when we see that student, right, we tend to look at that student and go, oh, they're just lazy, right? Or they just don't really care about school, okay? We attribute that behavior, sleeping, not caring, being late, not being focused, right? We attribute those things to that being a part of their personality. They're sleeping because they are lazy, right? They're sleeping in class because they are lazy. But we oftentimes don't see the situational aspect, right? Where it's not uncommon that you might see that exact same student, right, somewhere else, whether it's like out in the world at their job, or you see them, maybe they're an athlete or in their band or whatever, and they are completely different, right? Where they're working incredibly hard, maybe they're even a leader in, on the team or at their job. And what we've done there, right, is we've underestimated the situation that they're in. Right, we've underestimated how impactful the situation is on behavior. We tend to look at other people and we say, pretty much whatever they do is part of their personality, right? Until we're maybe sometimes shown a situation and how impactful that is. Now, we can also connect this with what's called self-serving bias, okay? So a self-serving bias is kind of the other side. So it's all about when we're looking at ourselves. So when we think about our own successes and our own achievements, we tend to attribute them to personality traits, to personal, stable causes, right? When you go and you take a test and you do really well on the test, you tend to think to yourself, I'm just smart, right? I'm smart, I work hard, I studied, right? That's why I did well on the test. Where if we have that similar example, right, where I go and I take a test, but I do really poorly, I tend not to just think I'm an idiot, right? I don't just immediately think I'm dumb, right? We tend to go, well, I did bad because I didn't get a chance to study because I was really busy. And if I had more time to study, I would have done better. Or the teacher didn't quite teach it well enough, and because they didn't teach it super well, I wasn't able to learn it correctly. Or the test wasn't asking the right things, and because of that, I did poorly, right? So we attribute our negative things, these failures, to the situations we're in, and we attribute positive things to our own personal characteristics. And again, you can see how these two things kind of differ, right? So when we look at other people, we pretty much attribute everything to their personality, good and bad, right? So when something negative happens, if they get in a fight, we look at that person, we say, oh, you just are an angry person, you're just aggressive, right? We underestimate the situation that's going on. With ourselves, if it's positive, we connect it to our personality. If it's negative, we connect it to the situation. Okay, so you can kind of think of how this is going to skew our ability to attribute correctly. The next piece is what is called the just world phenomenon. Okay, the just world phenomenon. So the just world phenomenon is this tendency to believe that the world is just. Pretty straightforward. Right? And that at the end of the day, people get what they deserve, right? You can think about it as like karma. At the end of the day, like the idea is that this belief that good things happen to good people get rewarded for what they do, bad things happen to bad people, right? Evil is punished. This is the idea of the just world phenomenon. Now, the just world phenomenon has goods and bad, like a good aspect and a bad aspect, right? So the positive side of the just world phenomenon is that it makes us feel good. It makes us feel secure. It makes us feel safe, right? If I look at the world and I think to myself, you know what? Good things are going to happen to good people. So if I'm good things will happen to me, right? That makes us feel secure. Same thing on the other hand, right? If I think to myself, you know what? Bad people are going to be punished, right? So when someone does something bad to me, or when I know there's someone who's doing something bad, I know that that eventually they will be punished for it and they won't just get away with it, right? Those are things that make us feel secure, makes us feel safe in the world. The negative side of that, though, is that it can be used to justify injustice, right? So one of the examples of this is the idea that, well, if I am really wealthy, or I am really powerful, or I'm really successful, that must mean I'm good, right? Because of that, right? Because I am wealthy, I am good, because good things happen to good people, right? And if you are unsuccessful or poor or struggling, well, that must mean there's something wrong with you. There's something bad about you, right? Because again, if good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, bad things are happening to you, that means you're bad. Good things are happening to me, that means I'm good, right? So you can kind of see how there's this positive aspect of this security, but also this kind of negative aspect that it can be then used to rationalize negative things, rationalized unjust things. So that gets us to what are called attitudes. So this whole first part has been all about attribution, right? How do we attribute what people are doing? Next thing we want to talk about are attitudes. So attitudes are feelings that predispose us to respond in a particular way to objects, people, or events. Okay. Now, obviously, our feelings are influenced by our beliefs. When you believe something, it tends to change how you feel about it, right? So, and again, the important piece is understanding these kind of connections, right? That we have an attitude. That attitude then predisposes us to act a specific way. So if I have a negative attitude towards a specific person, right, I'm going to be more likely to act in a certain way, more negatively, for example, towards that person, right? You can kind of see how those are connected, pretty straightforward. Now, there is also another aspect of this, though, which is the idea that our attitudes not only affect our actions, but our actions then also affect our attitudes. So, for example, I, have a negative attitude towards a specific person, right? We're in class and I have to talk to that person. When I talk to them, I'm probably not going to maybe behave the exact same way I would to somebody else, right? I might be a little more aggressive. I might be a little bit more snippy or short with them. I might not be super friendly with them, right? I'm going to act differently. Now, what's important is obviously how we act changes situations. So if I go and I'm aggressive towards someone, or if I'm short with somebody, or if I'm, kind of condescending to someone, that's going to also change how they act with me. So if I do those things, they're probably going to also interact with me in a negative way, right? Maybe they'll be more aggressive towards me or more negative towards me or whatever. That then affects my attitude towards them again, right? When someone's aggressive to you, it makes you think worse about them, right? You think more negative things. So you can see how there's kind of this cycle, right? Where our attitudes affect our behaviors, and then our behaviors affect our attitudes affect our behaviors, and it kind of goes on and on and on and on. Now, there are different types of attitudes, though, right? So there are what are called explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes. So explicit attitudes, and the big difference really is conscious versus unconscious. So explicit attitudes are conscious beliefs that guide our decisions and our behavior. So when you consciously know that you like somebody or something or certain types of situations, right, that is a conscious belief, an explicit attitude. And obviously, when you know you like something, it's going to affect how you act around it. We also, though, have implicit attitudes. Now, again, these implicit attitudes are unconscious beliefs. Now, they're still going to influence our decisions. They're still going to influence how we behave, but they are now unconscious. So we aren't able to actively pinpoint them or maybe even verbally express them. But they're still going to affect what we do, how we feel, how we behave. The next piece with attitudes is thinking about, what really is an attitude. So we talked about kind of what it does and about the different types, but what is it really? And we're going to talk really just about one specific model, which is called the ABC model of attitudes. The ABC model is pretty straightforward. There's 3 components, right? A, B, and C. It's something we've already talked about. Basically, at the end of the day, it's feelings, actions, and thinking. Okay, those are the 3 kind of pieces. So the first part is A, which is affective, right? If you think about someone's affect, it's feelings. The affective component is the emotional component, right? It's the way a person feels towards an object, person, or situation. We add that to the behavioral component, which is behavior, right? Actions. So the action that a person takes in regard to person, object, or situation, right? And then lastly, we have the cognitive component, which is C, right? ABC, which is our thinking. So the way a person thinks about a person, object, or situation. So all of those pieces come together and create an attitude, right? So if we're talking about a certain individual, right? How do I feel towards that individual? How do what actions do I take in connection to that individual? And how do I consciously think about that individual? Right? All of those things are mashed together, and that is our attitude towards that person. Right? So again, that's the ABC model: affective, behavioral, and cognitive. So the last thing we're going to talk about, or the next thing we're going to talk about, is thinking about how these different things are connected. So the big piece here is how are attitudes and actions connected to one another. Right? We've already kind of laid it out, but we want to talk about it a little bit more in depth. So like we already mentioned, we act in ways that are representative of our attitudes, right? Our attitudes affect our actions. Now, this is really important because it also can talk to us about how we can change people's attitudes and thus change people's actions, right? So one of the examples of this is what is called the peripheral route to persuasion. So the idea of the peripheral route to persuasion is to change someone's attitude and thus change their behavior. So the example we're going to use is political ads, right? The point of all political ads is to get you to vote a certain way, right? At the end of the day, that's their goal. Now, the way they're doing that is by changing how you feel. So if I can make you feel negatively towards somebody or positively towards somebody, that makes it more likely that you will carry out the behavior of voting for or against someone else. So the peripheral route to persuasion is specifically using superficial or emotion-based cues to then influence someone's attitude. So I'm sure all of you have seen political attack ads at some point in your life before. And it's pretty straightforward, right? There's like they're almost like always like black and white or really dark, right? There's like the big red letters. You can see both of the examples here, right? The red letters. There's always like 1 or 2 words, like these phrases that are like calculated or wrong for whatever, Nevada, right? There's these kind of specific phrases they'll use. But when you watch those ads, like they're not laying out like this super in-depth kind of explanation of why this person isn't the best person. It's very emotion-based, right? They want you to feel a certain way about that person. And again, the idea is if I make you feel really negatively about a political candidate, that makes you more likely to go and vote for the other one, right? Who I'm supporting. Now, the thing about peripheral route to persuasion is it tends to create really fast results. So when you watch it, you might immediately feel negatively about somebody else. And again, this could be positive as well, but you feel it really quickly. But it tends not to last super long, right? Most people don't base their actual values and views off of like a really emotional ad like this, right? So it tends to have quick results, but not necessarily last super long. On the other hand, we have what is called the central route to persuasion. Now again, the idea here is that we want people, or the idea here is we want to change your attitude, and then when we change your attitude, will change your behavior. So the central route to persuasion is the same kind of idea, but it's when we're going to think carefully about communication and is influenced by the strengths of arguments. So for example here, right, you can think about like a debate. Right now, obviously, like our political debates aren't necessarily the grandest, most perfect view or perfect example of the central route to persuasion, but in a lot of ways they are, right? They're much more longer form, especially when you get down to like only a few people. If there's only like 2 or 3 people, they're talking a lot more. They have to explain actual points. There's a lot more kind of back and forth between the two sides, right? And the idea here is in like a perfect world, right? That we would think carefully about what's being said, how it's being said, what these different arguments are, and then we're going to then be influenced by the arguments itself, right? That when I hear a really good argument for why we should do this or why we shouldn't do that, right? It's because of the argument, not because of the emotional part that I feel. Okay? Now, one of the things that's important about the central route to persuasion is that it tends to be a lot more durable. So, where peripheral tends to be a lot quicker, central tends to be more durable. Once I like believe in something, right? Once I agree with an argument for something, it tends to be a lot more resistant to other kind of impacts, right? So a simple example of this is like, and this is kind of what the thing in the bottom right is talking about, is maybe something like Medicare for all, right? If you want to make an argument for that, right, or expanding Medicare or medical or national medicine, right? If you were going to sit down and say, okay, we should do it because we'll save money, because more people will have treatment, we'll save people's lives, right? These different things. Those are all things that are going to be, you're going to make that decision based on the argument, right? So there's all these different kind of points that you're going to look at. Right, and so you can see the difference between that and saying somebody's calculated, which isn't really telling us anything. It just kind of makes us feel negative. Again, with both of them, what we're really doing is we're affecting your attitude about something, and then affecting your action based on it. We also, though, can see the other side of this. So we also know that our actions affect our attitudes. So if we can cause certain actions to happen, we can actually change people's beliefs. Okay, so there's 2 big examples of this, and these are both things that are actually coming from like salesmen, door-to-door salesmen, which is why they're called foot in the door and door in the face, right? They're salesman techniques, but they're really good examples of this, or that's what they're named after, right? But they're really good examples of this, where again the idea is we're going to cause certain actions to happen, and then those actions will change the beliefs. So the foot in the door technique is kind of one of the bigger ones, right? So the foot in the door technique is the idea of asking for a small commitment, which is oftentimes called an opener, and after gaining that compliance, asking for a bigger commitment, right? The reason it's called the foot in the door technique is door-to-door salesmen used to go around, and the first question would be something like, can I come in, right? And the idea is that once I'm inside, right, you're much more likely to say yes to something later on, right? Once you've given me that first yes, once you've said, sure, I'd like to hear about, whatever, you're much more likely to say yes to when I ask you to buy something, right? So I get a small commitment, and that makes me able to get a larger commitment, right? You can see how that kind of steps up. We also have what is called the door in the face technique. So the door in the face technique is basically the exact opposite of foot in the door, where I'm going to ask for a really large commitment that you can then refuse, right? So I ask for something really big, you then refuse it, and then I ask for something smaller, right? And when I ask for something smaller, you're more likely to agree. Now, again, the idea here is an action is changing your belief. So the action of being compliant at the beginning makes you more likely to be compliant later. Or the action of refusing something makes you more likely to agree to something later on, right? And you can think of a lot of really simple examples of this. So a really simple example could be something like maybe you want to go to your friend's house, right? And you want to spend the night there or whatever. And you go to your parents and you say, hey, mom and dad, can I go to John's house for the weekend? Right? Which is 3 days. I want to go Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'm going to stay all 3 days. And they're like, no, there's no way you can do that. And you say, okay, well, can I at least just go over tonight and come back tomorrow morning? And you're much more likely to get a yes then, right? Because again, after we refuse something, it makes us more likely to say yes to the next thing. That's a door in the face. We can also do the opposite, where you say, hey, you know what, my friend John's having a party. Can I go to John's house for the party? And they're like, yeah, I think that should be fine. And then you might be like, well, you know what, actually, can I spend the night? Can I just spend the night and come back tomorrow? Right? And after I've said yes that first time, it again makes me more likely to say yes the second time. So again, what we've done is we've basically caused the behavior to happen, or we've gotten an action, right? And that changed the feelings that they had about what you did next, what you asked next. We're going to watch a really good example of this, I think, at the end of class, which is the push, which is literally basically this, where they basically are using this to basically see how far they can get people to go by just basically kind of like using these different examples that we've talked about so far. The last thing we're going to talk about is, again, kind of thinking about this, but including the idea of roles. So the last piece here is thinking about how the idea that when we take on roles, we gradually become those roles. Okay? A simple example I can give you guys that's kind of very broad is any of you that have siblings, right? If you've ever like babysat your younger siblings, or if you're the younger sibling, I'm sure you've seen it in your older siblings, right? But either way, if you've babysat younger siblings or you've been babysat by your older siblings, one thing you may have noticed is during those situations, the person that is, babysitting oftentimes will start acting a lot more like your mother and father do, right? Like your guardians do than they would normally, right? So like if you're babysitting your younger siblings, right, you might notice if you pay attention to it that you start sounding and talking a lot more like your parents when you're babysitting them than you do normally, right? And the idea there is this idea that you're taking on this role of guardian, and so you kind of become that role, right? And we can say the same thing with a whole bunch of things, right? As me as a teacher, right? I take on a certain role of teacher, right? And because I take on that role, I slowly kind of become that role. I start to act more like that, talk more like that, dress like that, outside of that as well, right? So that's kind of the general idea. The big example that they're going to use usually in the AP Psych test is Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. It's one of the most famous psychological experiments probably all time. It was carried on by Philip Zimbardo. He's still alive, still a very influential psychologist. And what they were looking at was the psychological effects of becoming a prisoner or a prison guard. So they basically kind of set up like this fake prison at Stanford University, and I think it was in like a basement kind of thing. They had different students. I think they're all grad students, if I remember correctly, or maybe some undergraduates. And some of them were assigned to be guards of the prison. Some of them were assigned to be prisoners, right? And then they basically, had them run the prison. What they came up with at the end, right? So the guards enforced authoritarian measures and ultimately subjected some of the prisoners to psychological and physical torture. And then the results indicated that guards and prisoners developed role-appropriate attitudes, right? So that when I made these people prisoners, they acted like prisoners. When I made these people guards, they acted like guards. Now, when you're taking the AP Psych test, that's what I want you to put down. If they ask you any questions about Stanford prison experiment, that's what I want you to kind of look at. That's what I want you to connect it to, because that's what they're looking for. We'll talk about it more in class, and if we don't, please remind me. There are a lot of kind of like the Stanford prison experiment, I think, should be really taken with a grain of salt. There were a lot of kind of problems with the study. There was ethical problems with how it was carried out, with how accurate and honest the results really are. If there was kind of influence been being put on different groups to do different things. So there's kind of a lot of other things that we can talk about separately, but for the AP Psych test, this is what they're looking for, right? They're looking for you to say that, you're given a role, you take on that role. Okay, that's kind of the main piece here. All right. So the next piece then is what happens when our actions and our attitudes don't match up, when they conflict with one another, right? What happens then? And this is what is called cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is a sense of discomfort or distress that occurs when a person's behavior does not correspond to that person's attitudes. Okay? Now again, this really important part here is cognitive dissonance is the discomfort or distress that's caused by this. Okay? So when those things don't match up, we feel uncomfortable, we feel distressed. Okay? Now the way that we deal with this, there's kind of three ways that we're going to deal with this, right? And again, all we're trying to do is reduce that stress. So the first thing we can do is we can change our conflicting behavior to match our attitude. So a simple example of this could be if you think you are a loving, caring person, but then you cheat on your significant other, right? So when you do that, obviously the action you took doesn't match up with the attitude that you had, right? So you're going to start to feel distress, right? You feel discomfort because of that. So one thing I can do is change my behavior to match my attitude, right? So I say, you know what? I'm never doing this again. I'm going to act differently. I'm going to be more careful. I'm going to, make sure that I'm living the way that I feel like I should be living, right? That's the first way we can deal with it. The second way we can deal with it is changing our conflicting cognition to justify our behavior. So an example of this could maybe be where, I basically justify what I did through cognition, right? So I say, you know what, I am still a loving, caring person, but this relationship isn't good. They don't treat me as well as I should be treated. And because of that, I'm kind of justified in what I did, right? Maybe it's not necessarily good or bad, but I'm justified in doing that because this relationship isn't good enough, or they don't treat me as well as I should be treated, right? I'm changing my cognition to justify a behavior, okay? The last example is forming new cognitions to justify their behavior. So here what we're going to see is not necessarily like keeping everything the same, but I'm going to kind of form something completely different. So maybe an example of this could be, and again, we're using that same situation. So I think I'm a loving, caring person, but then I cheated on my significant other. Maybe my new cognition would be, you know what, I don't think that, maybe I don't believe in monogamy, right? So I don't necessarily think that love is necessarily between just two individuals, that it could be multiple individuals. And I can still be loving and caring. I just loving and caring for more than just that one person, right? That's a whole new kind of idea or a whole new kind of way of thinking that I'm adding in, and now it's, again, still justifying that behavior. So I either change the behavior to fit the attitude, I rationalize my behavior to justify it, or I come up with a new way of thinking that justifies the behavior as well, right? And again, the idea is any of these three is going to then reduce the discomfort, reduce the stress I feel because my attitudes and my actions aren't matching up. That's going to wrap up this video for today. So again, take a few moments, write 4 to 5 sentence summary on social cognition, and I'll see you guys next time.